The JRPG genre can be a confusing beast to engage with. The refinement we've enjoyed over the last 30 or so years is, for me, often and confoundingly accompanied by a deep yearning for admittedly seemingly archaic design principles that I can't simply attribute to nostalgia. It makes no sense on paper why someone that has become quite accustomed to all of the creature comforts afforded by now conventional and agreed upon methods of engagement and design would thoroughly enjoy Capcom's first true RPG outing from 1993. I think, after 30 or so hours in the game, it's because there are some truly brilliant instances of innovation and thought put into the title, and of course those awesome sprites and animations, even though they sit next to some tragically flawed and sometimes infuriatingly obtuse moments and decisions. Breath of Fire wastes literally no time jumping directly into the thick of things, which works in its favor, as languishing in early exposition would have further exposed its weaknesses. It immediately establishes the core conflict and hurls the main character Ryu out into the world, with the option to change his name at the beginning if the player decides to do so. He is one of the last remaining survivors of a race that can transform into dragons, called the Dragon Clan, more specifically the Light Dragon Clan, and he must battle the Dark Dragon Clan. The two groups splintered years ago and have remained at odds since, to rescue his sister and thwart their plans of domination. Characters are introduced as they each become mechanically necessary to progress early and as their clan or respective area is visited. Each had ways of interacting with the world that textured their joining in a more enjoyable way than I anticipated. Bo made it possible to walk through forests and to hunt, which bestowed items. Karn picked locks and detected traps, and so on and so forth. This gives a feeling of more involvement with their world, like they actually exist in it and are familiar with it. Even if, unfortunately, each character is poorly utilized in the story after their respective moments. It also lengthens the lifespan of each dungeon as revisits to unlock items and other subsequent areas become necessary with more tools from each character. It's a very muted and narratively sparse story until later in the game, but it feels refreshing in a way to not, even if it was more about text-based limitations, be bombarded with constant reminders of the importance or weight of a specific task in the grand scheme of things when it's glaringly obvious to the characters and game world at large. Though the game does painfully miss several early opportunities to show the human cost of impossible decisions, and most of the dialogic exchanges are quite short, rarely impressive, and aren't emotionally engaging until the very end. But again, it was a nice respite from later era titles that felt it must include a surfeit of sit-down scenes every 30 minutes to reiterate a journey's importance. Breath of Fire clearly establishes this early and reinforces it with the very familiar town-to-town dilemma formula, demonstrating the conflict's toll on the people and baking in the obvious necessity of the mission. Though it does begin to reveal more of the Dark Dragon Clan's particular brand of evil later in the game, there's no doubt the game could have benefited from deeper character interactions, which really only occur at the beginning of the game and the very end of the game. I didn't really expect early on to care for what would assuredly be predictable early to mid-90s JRPG story beats, and to be fair, I wouldn't argue against a player's narrative frustrations. I can see a reading of this game being exceedingly underwhelming for someone wanting more out of their game's world and deeper, more emotionally charged character exchanges. But given the game's aims, the nature of its in-game conflict, and the limitations it faced, I wasn't as perturbed by the bare-bones exchanges and shallow lore depth. Odd coming from me, I know, as I often foreground and privilege the story with more weight than any other category, and many of the first Breath of Fire's contemporaries were doing much more in that limited space. But its systems and sharp, smart, albeit sometimes flawed designs really kept me hooked. Combat here is classic turn-based action. It's initiated via random encounters, and actions are selected and then executed in an order determined by agility. Each character, even if most of their in-combat use boils down to the attack function, have unique visual flair and feel different, even if, in practice, most of them really aren't. Ryu can transform into various types of dragons for big damage. Karn has multiple different fusions with different team members for almost game-breaking damage. Honestly, his fuses make the game a little too easy. Ox is slow, but also strong, and Gobi is, well, not terribly useful outside of water, which makes plenty of sense narratively, but makes him laughable in combat. Both he and Bo, and eventually Ox, spend most of the game fused in one form or another to Karn. At least in my playthrough they did, because of how busted these forms are. But this is optional, again. Nina is a classic support character, and of course no team would be complete without the massively powerful sorceress. The game has an, at times, near overwhelming amount of minor frustrations, and a few that try to dig in harder as the game progresses. There's slightly overtuned random encounters. I happen to think this is often exaggerated, but it is still a bit much at times. A combat system that does admittedly boil down to spamming attack for the vast majority of encounters, even with your mages, as it's often not worth the trouble of selecting a stronger spell when it won't necessarily end the fight faster, which kind of makes auto battle the go-to and leaves so many potentially fun or creative spells unused. It has obscenely vague directional clues. Even if NPCs do try to help you, some connections are just kind of hard to make. Poorly explained equipment, and that's kind of being polite, recolors of common enemies, and so many more stumbles to mention that I really simply can't and won't argue with the naysayers. However, as I said earlier, I can't help but love the little nuggets of innovation and how fast this game gets you going. Even though it's far too easy to completely miss some of these creative and fun moments, like setting up a shop with Gobi, or fishing to find treasures and reuse dragon pieces, or hunting with Bo, these are fun and often quite rewarding momentary retreats from the stubborn march toward the end of the game. Enjoyable and impactful diversions that easily could have been bypassed by the creators. They are clever and contextually smart. It even has a day and night cycle that has meaningful gameplay implications. It's kind of also important to remember that though Breath of Fire's obfuscation is particularly severe at times, it does exist within an ecosystem that encourages players to experience its world. Fishing and hunting, for instance, these are a little difficult to properly explore if the player is quickly going from A to B without getting lost a bit, and reinforces an ideal common in that era: the sense of adventure and discovery after sometimes excruciatingly hopeless moments. I think it is, again, one of the more frustrating applications of this approach, and wouldn't fault anyone for finding it to be a bit too much, but it makes sense to be constructed that way. Even Makoto Ikihara, a designer on Breath of Fire 1 and director of Breath of Fire 3, talked about this approach in an interview with the PlayStation Magazine in 1997, stating, "If you don't have stuff like that, things for the players to do outside of the main quest, or when they get stuck or lost, it makes for a dull experience, you know? Just reading dialogue and going from story point to story point, that's not really that fun. I used to say things like, RPGs don't need stories, and just as long as the battles are fun, we're good. In reality, you can pretty much write out a game's entire story on a single piece of paper, right? But it takes dozens of hours to play through it, and most of the time is spent in battles or searching for items." While we can certainly disagree with his stance on telling stories in JRPGs, the aim and intent are clear here. Getting lost was intentional. Struggling to advance was purposeful. The player is supposed to enjoy that process in the world of Breath of Fire, and is often rewarded, even if minimally, for exploration. Of course, this is just simply going to depend on the player and what they want out of their experience, or how much they're willing to endure, and again, there are segments that get quite silly with its advancement clues. Nevertheless, I loved it, and I appreciate any game that tries to make its overworld interactive and intriguing. There are also nice little audio touches when walking over bones in old caves, little crunchy noises that immediately catch you off guard. There are several instances of little details like this, like towns welcoming your return after you save them from some threat, which just enhance the experience, and again, the sprites are lovely and the animations are excellent and sharp. Breath of Fire might also have, dare I say, one of the more wildly underrated soundtracks, one that I rarely hear mentioned, and several of the mainstream reviews failed to discuss it at all. Possibly because the composers were originally named under their pseudonyms and listed as their team name, Alf Lyla, but in any case, it's solid and one of the stronger outings from that era. It might seem like a bit of a cop-out, and I've certainly said this before about other titles, but sometimes the thrust of the experience and the incipient, nascent bits of innovation and the overall feel of the game outweigh the sometimes infuriatingly flawed missteps, which I'll concede can be quite aggravating here and can feel overwhelming when tallied. It's also no wonder that my love for that era of JRPGs specifically, both in terms of aesthetics and the economy of design, often biases some of my engagements. But the first Breath of Fire really is more special, to me at least, than it is often framed. Combat is just fun, even if it is mostly auto-battling in the same tried-and-true process for most boss encounters. It wastes no time dumping you into its world and its struggles, and I'm starting to find that while its offerings might not be as expertly communicated, this era's payoffs and discoveries often end up feeling considerably better for me, whether that be nostalgia, an appreciation for the era's aesthetics or design or its simple combat or all of that. I don't know. I like the frustrations often associated with the progenitors of the JRPG genre. Though it grew rapidly and matured out of these purportedly antiquated approaches to advancement in storytelling, I still have a pronounced soft spot for this time period, even the flawed titles it produced. I almost skipped this in order to just jump right into Breath of Fire 3 because of the discourse surrounding the first two titles. I'm really quite glad I didn't. I absolutely enjoyed my time with this game.